forcing it into a kind of macrophysical cascade, which is life, consciousness, and self-reflection.
And you see this described in the I Ching.
Yes, I think the I Ching is an abstract modeling system for breaking this down to its simplest elements and then seeing how it works. Now, we're accustomed to thinking of science as linear progress from the distant past to the present. What I'm suggesting is that at least in the matter of time, the Chinese of the pre-Han period had a much more true and formally applicable notion of time than we ourselves do. We have failed in our effort to assimilate time into our physics because of our obsession with matter and the release of energy.
Now, there are some scholars who suggest that the African Yoruba people, with their system of divination called Ifa, which has a cycle, I think, of 244 or 264 various myths and stories, is even more sophisticated than the I Ching, which has only 64. Have you looked into that?
I have looked into it. What makes the I Ching so powerful in my mind is that it appears to be an exact analogy to the mechanism of DNA.
Oh.
There are 64 codons, which code for amino acids in DNA. There are 64 hexagrams. There are 8 primary hexagrams. There are 8 indispensable amino acids. I felt that really the I Ching is like mankind's best shot at this because it has this reflection in the biological matrix out of which consciousness emerged.
In other words, the various ancient divination systems may all reflect a striving of human beings towards this intuitive understanding of the cyclical nature of time and the relationship between mind and the flow of time, and yet the I Ching may have just sort of hit the nail on the head better than the others.
Well, it's like looking at a 17th century description of the motion of the planets or a 20th century description. These are basically refinements. But yes, I think that the I Ching represents a primary perception of the organization of mind, time, and matter. And I'll even tell you how I think they got a leg up. I think basically there is a tradition in Central Asia of the so-called stilling the heart techniques vis-a-vis yoga. And these are techniques where vital functions are suppressed. Breathing becomes very minimal. All exterior inputs are suspended. And eventually, I think the Chinese sages who practiced this form of meditation noticed a flux at the center of the stillness, which they called Tao, and which they set out to phenomenologically describe, not knowing whether it was physics, organism, or deity. And they did not prejudge this question. They simply gave a phenomenological description of the transcendental flux that they encountered in states of deep yogic ecstasy. And lo and behold, it turns out that this is the perfect technique for studying time. Time is not a phenomenon where you build machines with 8-kilometer diameters that cost trillions of dollars. Time is a phenomenon to be studied by attending dinner parties, perhaps, or pursuing love affairs, or watching the passing of the seasons. Activities much more commiserate with our vision of the Taoist sage than the white-coated scientist of the present world religion of science. So, really, I think it was an involvement in organism and in the human experience.
In other words, the laboratory for studying time would not so much be our observatories or our systems of quartz clocks, but rather looking inside of ourselves, observing our own organism.
That's exactly precise, and the workings of our own psychology. To my mind, the greatest commentator on time in the 20th century after Albert Einstein would certainly have to be Marcel Proust. Proust understood more about the time we experience and was able to communicate it than any person who has ever lived. And that's within the confines of what most people consider a fairly effete, highbrow literary project.
Swan's Way.
Well, the entirety of Remembrance of Things Past.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't read that, so you've got me a bit in the dark here, and we have about 5 minutes left, so could you summarize that point or amplify it a bit?
Well, I think the point we're trying to make here, that I have been involved with over the past few years, is that a revisioning of time would assuage much of what is called modern anxiety, and that we have limited the categories we were willing to entertain in dealing with this problem, and that we must genuflect to the ancient Chinese and take a page from their notebook in this matter. The I Ching as a divinatory system of great age, reflecting the dynamics of our own genetic material, and also, though I didn't mention this evening, it also has deep calendrical properties, can be used to keep track of time, lays a basis for an understanding of this curious phenomenon called synchronicity, the coincidental meshing of interior psychic events and exterior events in the real world. It lays a basis for us to understand the unity of ourselves with the real world that our present approach makes difficult to discern.
So whereas Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychiatrist who wrote, incidentally, the preface to Richard Wilhelm's book of the I Ching and postulated this theory of synchronicity, well, Jung didn't really provide any mechanism for synchronicity. He simply said it works this way, that the mind seems to be related to these events, and he found an enormous therapeutic benefit from that understanding. What you're suggesting is that the potential mechanism behind the Jungian notion of synchronicity has to do with the structure of time itself.
That's right.
And you must be suggesting, therefore, that the human mind at this very deep level that the sages discovered from stilling their organism, that the mind has a parallel structure, an isomorphic structure.
That's exactly the central point. The mind arises out of matter. This is why the I Ching works in both worlds. One is the reflection of the other. The key to healing the apparent dualism lies in studying the temporal mechanics indicated by the I Ching. And I believe we've done this formally, mathematically.
Terence McKenna, you're taking the provocative position that the I Ching, which some people view as religion and other people dismiss as superstition, is actually a science. And I gather that your computer software package, Time Wave Zero, proposes to be the demonstration of that.
We believe it does demonstrate it. Of course, ultimately it will be up to our colleagues to judge the worth of our case.
Terence, it's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for being with me.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be here, Jeffrey, and discuss this with you. It's not an easy subject, believe me.
And thank you very much for being with us.